Welcome back from a scrutiny of our appropriation process at the federal and state level. Let's now move to our election management process. Of course, the Ekiti election, the latest off-cycle election, has been concluded with results, with commendations on the logistics management process of that particular election as against what obtained in the past, but with very huge concerns around voter inducement, vote buying, and all of those related issues. But of course, Election Watch Yaga Africa has produced a document that is very important and is at this time needed as we head into the next general elections in 2027. But of course, with another test coming through for INEC, the Osun election in August. And this looks at our election results management process against the backdrop of the provisions of the Electoral Act 2026 as amended. Joining us now from our Abuja studio is Mr. Samson Itodo, the Executive Director of Yaga Africa, and of course is a good governance advocate and of course a key election observer of our election process. Mr. Itodo, thank you for coming on the program, and thank you indeed for holding on.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Yes, we've been looking at the latest document produced by your organization titled Securing the Vote, and perhaps you want to begin by taking us through the elements in this particular document. I see here what the Electoral Act 2026 changed, and there are some pointers. Transmission now compulsory, IREV becomes a legal record, and a second direct transmission. Perhaps you want to break this down for the electorate who should be interested in this, by the way.
Well, thank you very much. You know very well that the weakest link in our entire election administration or election value chain is the results management process. That is a process that is very contested, perhaps the most contested component of our electoral process after party primaries and candidate nomination. What we did is to release a policy brief on the electronic transmission of results, because the new act makes transmission of results to the IREV compulsory. Now, there are two fundamental findings. The first one, which the public needs to be aware of, is that the results from the polling units are not transmitted automatically to the INEC IREV. They go through a validation process before they are published on the IREV. And this is one of the major findings in this policy brief, because if you look at the Ekiti elections and the way the results hit the IREV, they hit the IREV in bulk and not streaming in. So let's look at Ekiti. When the first results or the set of results that hit the INEC IREV portal came in at 4:10 p.m., that's 1 hour, 30 minutes after the close of polls. There were 4 results that hit the portal. Few minutes later, the figure rose to about 247. When you look at between 6:32 and 6:37, over 1,100 results made it to the portal. So if you have 1,100 results making it to the IREV portal within 5 minutes, it just confirms the fact that INEC validates results before they are uploaded and published on the IREV. That's the first thing that the public needs to be aware of. The second point is that INEC, through its regulation, has introduced what we call the electronic ECA8. In other words, what the public knows is that once elections have been concluded at the polling units and the results entered into the ECA8, party agent sign and the presiding officer signs, they take an image of the result sheet with the BVAS and transmit your upload to the IREV. The new procedure is that once polls have been concluded at the polling units and the result sheets have been signed and stamped, the presiding officer will now enter those figures on the hard copy result sheets into an electronic ECA8 on the BVAS and then transmit to INEC. So in other words, you have one results transmitted in 3 different forms. So the first one is the hard copy results. The second one is the electronic ECA8 on the BVAS. And the third one is the scanned result sheet that we see on the IREV. What INEC said is that the electronic ECA8 is for validation. That again is subject to interrogation and question. But one thing is clear, is that the public is not fully aware of this new regime of results management. And some of the questions we're asking is that if you have 3 results pathways, if there is a discrepancy between these 3 different results, which one takes precedence? The second point is that INEC needs to explain this back-end validation that happens before results make it to the IREF, because when the process is opaque and it's not visible to the public, it creates room for suspicion. So when you look at the 5 different stages of results management, only 2 of them are visible to the public. The first one is the recording of the results sheet at the polling unit, and the second one is what is visible on the IREF. The other 3 procedures are not visible to the public. And so we'll be calling for transparency, that INEC needs to issue protocols, for how results are managed so that the public can understand, especially with the new provisions in the Electoral Act. The second thing is INEC needs to publish the EC8Bs, that is the ward collation result sheets, and the local government result sheets on the IREF. Because if you publish only the EC8As, that's the results at the polling unit, the public needs to know what happened at the ward level, what happened at the local government level. And our belief is that INEC has the infrastructure, to publish this, because it has promised in time past that it was going to do so.
So Mr. Itodo, do you think this is perhaps a deliberate attempt, to get the process this complicated? Do you think it's a deliberate attempt? Because I remember the last elections, when we got to the INEC's office, where the results were being collated. By the time I entered where some of those officials were, I saw them with calculator and biros and sheets, calculating seriously. So is this a deliberate attempt to perhaps leave this process this way because of interests? And secondly, this issue of the manual process, like you've said, are we still going to see that at the collation centers?
So your question about whether this is a deliberate, first, let's recognize that the National Assembly passed a law, and the law under section 60 requires that INEC must transmit results electronically to the IREF. It's mandatory. Although the provisor in that particular act, or that particular provision, says that for collation and declaration of results, the physical EC8A will be the primary source. And this was a subject of contestation because that provisor was not needed. And this is what the National Assembly did by intentionally and deliberately scuttling the entire process of electronic transmission of results. And you are aware of those debates. The second is, the law says that in the event of communication failure, now what INEC ought to have done with its regulations and guidelines is to explain what is a communication failure and what happens when there's a communication failure. What the regulations and guidelines says under paragraph 40, it says that the presiding officer will submit a report. The guidelines or the regulations does not say what is the format of the report, what is the constitutive elements of the report, what will happen to the report when it is submitted. So there are a lot of gray areas that INEC needs to explain, because if it doesn't explain this using the instrumentality of its regulations and guidelines, people will continue to infer or suspect that there is some interest out there that it's not get towards deepening the transparency of the process. My assumption is that some of these innovations are introduced to deepen the integrity of the process. But we should not complicate the process any further, because the more we complicate it, the more confusing it is. Because like you referenced, one of the biggest challenges of the resource management process is the quality of the people who are managing the process. And what kinds of trainings do they receive? The kinds of trainings that are required for the management of results is not the one where you do overnight. It has to be long-term training. You see those computational errors, some of them are just a function of poor training, which is why we have recommended in the policy brief that INEC needs a separate manual for results management so that everyone involved in the management of results is adequately trained. But it's not just training, it's also oversight of those individuals who are managing the process. Sometimes you train those people, but they become compromised, by politicians, and they undermine the process.
Mr. Itodo, let's assume that a check or a form of oversight for these people who results process is the electronic forms ECA8 that you referred to earlier on, which is a transference of the hard copy from ECA8 into an electronic from ECA8. Now, the party agents will append their signatures to the hard copy from ECA8. In case after an election has been concluded and aggrieved parties are headed to court to challenge the outcome of a result, if the hard copy from ECA8 is different from what we find on the portal, can hard copy from ECA8 be admissible in court?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and that's why we have said INEC needs to issue a protocol to explain this. One of the bigger questions is if you have 3 results from one polling unit and there is a discrepancy, which one takes precedence? Now, if you look at the design of section 60 sub 3 and the provisor, which says that for collation and declaration of results, the ECA8As, the physical ECA8As will be the primary source of result. The big question is, what if that primary ECA8A is the one that is falsified and compromised? And that's why the provisor in section 60 sub 3 was unnecessary. The politicians put it there deliberately because of instances of this nature, because they know very well that when they want to rig elections, they compromise INEC officials to mutilate and falsify and alter figures on the ECA8A. So when the ECA8A, the physical ECA8A is already compromised, then what you will be validating, what you will be declaring is a false result. But the law now confers primacy on the physical result. And this is the most unfortunate and perhaps disappointing and dark side of the 2026 Electoral Act. The National Assembly didn't need to place that primacy, because what was the IREF supposed to serve? It was supposed to serve the purposes of validation. Once election have been concluded at the polling unit, you take an image of it, upload on the IREF, so that at the collation, even if results have been manipulated, the physical ECA8As have been altered, at the collation officer will look at the results directly transmitted from the polling unit and compare. And so when there is a discrepancy, you rely on the one that was directly transmitted from the polling unit. Unfortunately, this is the problem with the 2026 Electoral Act. The politicians, those in the National Assembly, already designed this process to deliver a certain outcome, because they know that part of the tactics in the playbook of election riggers is to confer the primacy that they have conferred now on the ECA8, the physical ECA8As.
Very, very worrying indeed. And if there's any time that the saying suffices that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, it will be now against the backdrop of the Nigerian elections. But we must anchor at this point. There's so many other levels to explore on that document provided by Yaga, and Nigerians would do well to explore it on their own. Perhaps they would find it on all your platforms. Mr. Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa, and he's also a good governance advocate. Thank you indeed for coming on the program.
Thanks, always a delight. Thank you.